Campers. Good morning and welcome to Forming Fantasy. We're talking about how to write fantasy fiction. This is kind of near and dear to my heart because I'm a fantasy author by trade. I'm going to skip my usual introduction here, but we will talk about our agenda for the day. We're going to talk about defining what fantasy is. We'll talk about subgenres. We'll talk about the tropes. We'll talk about writing tips and developing magic systems. I do have a secret category in there. I'll let you guys figure that one out. And then we have a writing prompt that I think is going to be a lot of fun. All right, so like I said, skipping my usual introduction. For those of you, though, tuning in online, hi, I'm Garrett, and this is what I do. All right, so we're talking about defining fantasy. It is a fictional genre that is a lot of fun. And, hey, come on in. Have a seat. We're just starting, so good timing. All right, so it is a fictional genre that involves magical and supernatural elements. Either in the world building itself or in the characters. It involves imaginary worlds or some kind of underlying world that has a hidden version beneath it. It has obviously characters that exist that are familiar with this world. Sometimes you get a fish out of water type scenario, and we'll talk more about that when we discuss subgenres. It does have its own set of physical laws, so like its own laws regarding physics and how the world works as far as nature and the supernatural and stuff like that. It usually has themes of magic, mythology, or an alternate life. So if you are thinking of something like Harry Potter, where you do have an ordinary world, there is an alternate life behind the scenes. And in defining fantasy, the setting may be in an alternate world, like Middle Earth or Narnia, or it might be in which that alternate world has its own time, its own logic. A lot of the times fantasy tends to lend itself towards a medieval time period. Game of Thrones is really good with that. Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, all have that medieval vibe to them, and there's a reason for that. And because a lot of the times technology does not develop because there's something else that can get in the way. In this case, typically in fantasy, it is the use of magic. Magic is kind of supersedes technology because it can be an ex machina for doing all sorts of things. But then you also have in a lot of cases dragons. That's why, like, if you look at the world of Westeros and Essos in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's very clear that they will never get out of a medieval setting because dragons exist. There's no weapon in the world that can surpass the literal firepower of a dragon. Then it's fantasy is also distinguished from sci-fi by the narrative's plausibility. So it should be sci-fi, not sci-if. I apologize for that typo. But science fiction usually because especially if it's hard science fiction, it tends to lend itself to more plausibility. Whereas fantasy doesn't have that because it's dealing with something that is more supernatural and mythological. It's also distinguished from horror by the lack of the macabre, but at the same time, you can incorporate horror elements into your storytelling. For example, in my books, I do have vampires, and they are one horror element that I think works very well within the setting. And you can play around with that as you need to. And as we talk about subgenres, you'll see that there are some subgenres that lend itself towards blending with other types of literature. So examples of fantasy include A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. It's all about a group of humans who travel into a forest during the midst of an argument and trying to avoid romantic entanglements and others who are pursuing romantic entanglements. It gets really weird, but they encounter a group of fairies that are deciding to have fun with them. Then there's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Tolkien's lore is probably considered the epitome of high fantasy or epic fantasy. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland could be considered portal fantasy, and we'll talk about that in subgenres, because she does pass into another world that is separate and defined from the world that she knows. It's a dreamscape. Chronicles of Narnia, again, portal fantasy, lends itself to the medieval and the epic fantasy, but also works as allegory. The way that C.S. Lewis wrote the stories is allegorical to Christian life, because he looked at what his good best friend J.R.R. Tolkien wrote with the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, and said, "You didn't go far enough with the allegory. I'm going to beat you to it," and he outdid him with 9 books. So that's, yeah. As far as subgenres go, okay, we have quite a list of subgenres, and I'll kind of break them down here for just a moment. We've got dark fantasy. This is where you have the traditional fantasy elements. It will probably have a medieval setting, but darker tones. So you might deal with vampires, you might deal with werewolves, you might deal with demons or ghosts or hauntings of some kind or another. Sword and sorcery, this is typically what people think of when they think of fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons is a great example. Pretty much anything by Brandon Sanderson or R.A. Salvatore are on that list. Comic fantasy. This is where it's a fantasy setting. You have fantasy elements that are traditional to the genre, but it goes towards the comedic and the absurd, and it gets really fun. One of those types would be actually the most recent Dungeons and Dragons movie that came out last year, Honor Among Thieves, because while it has a serious story, there are a lot of comedic moments, and the characters just do some really absurd things. Another version that would be considered comic fantasy is the Amazon animated series, Legend of Vox Machina, which just completed its 3rd season, and while it has really serious storytelling, really great visuals and action set pieces, and uses of magic and other fantasy elements, it is funny right through its core. There's a lot of humor to it, and it's irreverent in its humor. Then you have historical fantasy. Historical fantasy is where you have fantasy that's based in a real historical setting. There was an audiobook I listened to recently, a few months ago, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name. It's on Audible, but it is set during the Blitz in London, and it follows Winston Churchill as he's trying to mount a defense against the Nazi Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and he partners with demons, and then he backstabs the demons and isolates them to this spit of land in the middle of the Atlantic, and to help win those battles. And so it uses the historical setting, but it creates a fantasy world where the supernatural exists. Then you've got urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is where you have more of a modern day setting. So you could have a place like Hanford or New York or London or some other location, but those fantasy elements still take place. Yes?
With or without, sorry.
No, you're fine.
With or without actually identifying the location. In other words, I have urban fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, well, you can...
But I stay away from identifying the place. People who know the place will immediately recognize the place. but it's not named.
Yeah, and you can choose to identify the urban location or not. That's up to you. I actually listened to an audiobook earlier in the last couple months called Tansy Bloom Monster Hunter, and she hunts supernatural things. And it's kind of like Dresden. Excuse me. It's kind of like the Dresden Files in a way, but it's urban fantasy. It takes place in a part of the eastern part of the UK near the coast, and all the locations, all the city streets and everything that are listed, they're all real places. Like I was able, in the 4-hour audiobook, I was able to sit there and look at the map of where Tansy is traveling.
The reason I do it is because one of the set pieces,
Mm-hmm.
one of them is a city, a known city, but right next to that known city is another known city that is 3,000 miles away. But I need them to be next to each other for my story. So by not naming anything, I can do whatever I want. Yeah,
and you can always play with that. Then you've got Grimdark. Grimdark is it's a darker. It takes dark fantasy, but it takes it into a dystopian type of setting. So cataclysmic, the world has ended, almost verging on cosmic horror with the amount of destruction that is involved in Grimdark. Then you have epic or high fantasy, and this is typically what most people think of, along with sword and sorcery, when they think of fantasy. They think of large castles, grand scale environments, epic quests, huge adventures, lots of characters. But then we also have fairy tales. Fairy tales are fun because with fairy tales, you can tell a story that's more kid-oriented, or if you're one of the Grimm's brothers, you can tell a fairy tale that is incredibly bleak and awful because they were German. And that's typically how those stories... Hey, I'm German too, so I get it. But like, if you look at every single one of the stories of the Grimm...
I totally agree with you.
Yeah, but you look at those stories and man, they are absolutely bleak fairy tales.
Especially the original ones.
Especially the originals, yes. And because a lot of the times fairy tales were meant to tell a lesson. They're meant to teach a lesson.
Right.
Then you've got, and this is the one I hate the most, romantasy. This is where you have a romance story, a romance-centric story that is set in a fantasy setting. So books by authors like Rebecca Yarros or Sarah J. Maas, those books lean more on the romance side of storytelling. They focus more on the relationships between the male and female characters. I think there's a small hobgoblin down there. And so that becomes the focus. I actually had a review on my first book on Amazon or Goodreads where the reader read through the entire book and marked me down because she was upset that there was not enough spice and romance in the story. And I'm like, well, that's not the core of the story. That wasn't the major plot point. Nothing about the cover art suggests that. Yeah.
I have a story I'm working on right now where it's not a romance in the typical sense because the two characters, one which is human and one which is not, they have absolutely no romantic interest in each other. It's totally platonic.
Great.
One is male and one is female. And that does matter.
Yeah.
But would that be considered a romance story?
Not really. I mean,
Okay.
It would be unless they're getting romantically involved.
No, they're not.
And they're getting themselves into really adult situations. Probably not.
I have a 12-year-old girl reader standard.
Okay, there you go.
If I'm not happy about a 12-year-old girl reading what I'm writing, I need to change something.
Yeah.
I don't always succeed. I do not succeed at all, but it's still the standard I'm working on.
Yeah. And so with romantasy, So another example of romantasy would be like the Twilight series, because while Twilight uses werewolves and vampires, technically it's done in a way where there's more magic involved in it, and it's more supernatural, less of a horror vibe than anything else, and there's a huge romance plot point. Like the vampires and werewolves are almost a subplot within a story about vampires and werewolves. But I was looking for quotes on fantasy, and I don't know who provided this quote. It's listed as unknown, but sometimes we need fantasy to survive the reality. And I absolutely believe that. This is one of the reasons why I tend to read fiction more than anything else, because my life is already, crazy enough as it is. I'd rather just read something that takes me out of that rather than reading something that's nonfiction. But I do read the nonfiction because it does help supplement what I do as a writer. Now, we want to talk fantasy tropes. And so these are the ones that I'm going to list are going to be considered the most common amongst fantasy tropes. The first one is the chosen one trope. We see this with Star Wars. We see this with Arthurian legend. We see this one with Harry Potter. It's a character who often comes from humble beginnings, who is destined to fulfill a great prophecy or meant to save the world. All right. Luke Skywalker is kind of a chosen one only simply because he is the last of the Skywalker line that they know of. And he is meant to battle against Darth Vader. Yeah, James.
Does that mean like Percy Jackson?
Percy Jackson falls very much into the chosen one trope because he is destined to save the world from, yeah.
Take a little bit of thunder away. This whole concept, including the chosen one, and many other things that come with fantasy tropes, which you're going to talk about, I know, can be read about in a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces.
I'm actually coming to that in just a little bit.
I had that book.
Yeah, read it, understand it,
Yeah.
and you will understand tons.
Yeah. And I'll actually come back to that in a moment. What's your name?
My name is John,
John. Thank you, John. I'll come back to that in just a moment, John.
and I will be quiet.
No worries. I love the commentary. I like the involvement. So the next trope is the Dark Lord. The Dark Lord is a powerful, malevolent villain embodying ultimate evil, seeking to dominate or to destroy the world. Think Emperor Palpatine. Think kind of Darth Vader, not so much. Voldemort for sure. Think the Kardashians. That's a joke. So the Dark Lord is a common trope, a common figure, and while they serve as the representation of ultimate evil, it is also fun to have to make some twists and to make some changes. Not necessarily just to subvert the trope, but also to make it your own and do something different with it. The next trope that we're going to be hitting on is the mentor, which, referencing Joseph Campbell and the hero with 1,000 faces, when Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey, which we will mention later on, the mentor is like step 3 or 4 in the hero's journey, typically. And this is a character that is a wizened, experienced character who guides the protagonist on their journey. This can be Obi-Wan Kenobi. This can be Gandalf in whichever hobbit he's working with. This could be, what's the centaur's name in Percy Jackson?
I know.
Chiron, thank you. I kept wanting to say James Bond because he was originally played by Pierce Brosnan. Dumbledore, McGonagall, any of those wizened, older, experienced characters who can provide insight, to provide guidance. Yoda works into this as well. If you go back to the original, or not the original, but the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, that mentor is Qui-Gon Jinn for Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi becomes a mentor of sorts to Anakin, even though he himself is a central protagonist of the next couple of films. So you can kind of play around with that. There's also going to be a magical artifact. Okay, this is a powerful or significant object central to the plot, usually a weapon or a talisman or a relic. Essentially, it is the MacGuffin of the story. All right, this is the thing that your hero is searching for, whether they're using it, whether they want to use it as a way to defeat the bad guy or if they're trying to keep it from the bad guy. The goal is to find whatever this artifact is. It could be the Sorcerer's Stone. It could be the Golem's Eye, the Ptolemy's Gate. It could be the Amulet of Samarkand. Those last three are books in a trilogy by Jonathan Stroud called the Bartimaeus Trilogy. Awesome series, urban fantasy, set in modern day London. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. But this magical artifact can do something. It is incredibly powerful. For the sake of Star Wars, it is Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber that is passed on by Obi-Wan Kenobi to Luke. And what's funny is if you look at the prequels and how they play out and then you go back and rewatch A New Hope, Obi-Wan actually lies to Luke Skywalker about the lightsaber. He says, your father wanted you to have this when you were old enough, but your uncle wouldn't allow it. At no point did Anakin ever make that statement to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan lied to Anakin, said, or lied to Luke and said, here, this is your father's. He wanted you to have it. I stole it. That's the part he leaves out, is that he stole it after he allowed Anakin to get lit on fire.
And don't forget the limb cutting part.
Also, yes.
He couldn't really take it back.
There were a few lies in the Star Wars stuff.
Yes. And a lot of that has to do with retconning and just not paying attention to script and dialogue, but still it's fun to kind of get in your own headcanon about why those omissions.
And you can accept I've been able to build a reasonable, plausible reason for every mistake I found in Star Wars, except one.
I'll have to talk to you about that one later. So then we're talking about the hero's journey. This was the narrative structure that was detailed and highlighted in The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. It deals with the hero embarking on an adventure, facing trials, and the hero returning to what used to be their ordinary life as a changed person. They have grown, they have evolved as a character in some way, shape, or form by the events of their experience. Yes, James.
Like the Hobbit?
Like The Hobbit, like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings, like King Arthur. Because if you look at Arthurian legend, King Arthur starts off as a peasant. He does not know his origins. He does not know anything about himself. And he is eventually crowned king when he's like 12 or 13 years old. And he is raised to be king. And you later find out that he is actually the son of Uther Pendragon, who was the previous king who left behind no heir. And we'll come back to that trope in just a little bit. Okay? But the hero's journey is classic. If you're writing fantasy, this is one that's really easy it's kind of a really easy by the book, literally, way to write out your story and to plot it out. Because if you look at Star Wars, if you look at Harry Potter, they follow this model to a T. In fact, if you put them side by side, the original Star Wars film and the original Harry Potter film, they hit the exact same beats at roughly the same time.
And that's why they're both really popular.
Exactly. And
this is not an imaginary sort of, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I just don't know why it's come. It's a big deal that they use. This is an old recipe. I mean, it's been around for 1,000 years.
yeah.
And it still works.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, any classic mythology story follows this model. The next one is The Prophecy. Dun, dun, dun. It's an ancient prediction foretelling significant events or destiny of key characters, and it drives the narrative. So that prophecy might be, it was prophesied that one day you would come and destroy the Sith, not join them. Or it was prophesied that you and the Dark Lord would face each other, and one of you is destined to die. Harry is the only person who survived that the first time around. Actually, the second time around, too. There's so many times that Harry Potter should have died. But the prophecy is there. It is kind of an overhanging thread. One of the ways to deal with that is you can have the prophecy be an overarching thing throughout a book series, like they do with Harry Potter, or it could be a one and done type of thing. I play around with a prophecy in my first book where it kind of becomes a one and done situation. The next one is the quest, and I'm a big fan of the show Bluey, and one of my favorite episodes from season 3 is called The Quest, where Chili is telling her kids that she's on a quest to find rainbow-colored yarn, and her youngest daughter, Bingo, goes with her husband, Bandit, to go on a curry quest, because they're swapping curry with some neighbors. And they, like, the whole time the story is going, Chili is narrating to Bluey about what happens on a quest, all the different steps, and it kind of hits the beats of the hero's journey to an extent. And you get to see this little microcosm of how the quest and how the hero's journey play into each other. But
That's really good. I'm sorry. I'm a huge Bluey fan.
Yeah, a lot of people are.
And I've never, ever thought of that.
Yeah.
Being the way it is.
And so this quest is a journey undertaken by your protagonist or your protagonists to achieve a specific goal, often involving numerous challenges. Again, see the hero's journey. The next one is the secret heir. Okay, this ties back to Arthurian legend. This ties back to Luke Skywalker. This ties back to Harry Potter. It's a character who is unaware of their royal or powerful or noble lineage and often lives an ordinary life. And you see this play out. If you've ever read the Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, it starts with the book Aragon. Aragon is he's a secret heir, but he's not entirely sure whose heir he is, because he's given some very interesting misinformation at the very beginning, intended to protect him. And he is given the sword of a very evil dragon rider. And in the second book, called Eldest, come to find out there's a second secret heir. And it's a character that was traveling with him in the first book. His name is Murtagh. Murtagh turns out to be his older half-brother. And he is the eldest. He is the heir to their father's sword. And so this leaves him having to go and forge a brand new sword.
We're saying that right. I think I said that right.
You did. Okay? This, and you see this play out a lot. And it's a common trope. It's fun to work with. One of the ways that I play around with it is that one of the characters in my first book come to find out he's half celestial. He has no idea. Ironically enough, he is raised in a monastery around with a group of monks and priests who worship the beings that he is descended from, and he has no idea what his heritage is like until midway through the book. Ironically enough, he's agnostic.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the point. Play around with it, have some fun. Then we've got the loyal sidekick. Okay? This is your Chewbacca. This is your Ron Weasley. This is Samwise Gamgee. Although I would dare say that Samwise is more of a hero than Frodo ever was. Especially considering the fact that he's the one who faces Shelob. He's the one that literally carries Frodo up to the edge of Mount Doom.
The secret hero then, in the same concept of the secret heir.
He would be a secret hero, yeah.
Yeah, so because he's not the main character, but I would wager he is the main character. Everyone wants to be Frodo, but Sam is actually the one getting things done.
Right. Yeah, James.
So like Raphtalia from Rise of the Shield Hero?
Possibly. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that
Or
story.
any of the actual identified sidekicks in Most of the Marvel series.
Most of Marvel, or I mean, if you look at any of the classic Disney films, I mean, Ariel had Flounder and Scuttle and Sebastian. Belle had a horse, and she had the various.
Moana has Hey Hey.
Moana has Hey Hey the chicken. God, that chicken is so funny.
That chicken is.
I love that the
That chicken is not long for this world. That's what's going on with that
What's
chicken.
great is the voice of the
I've
chicken.
got a little story I worked on, and then I'm gonna work on more, which is Spider-Man,
Mm-hmm.
and he has a roommate in college. He's in college, and he knows he's Spider-Man, of course, but he's just a guy going to college.
Yeah.
And his roommate discovers one day in his closet the suit. Okay, and he figured out already that something was weird.
Yeah.
And so he's decided to call himself Web Boy.
Oh God, that's awful.
And they have this
Kind of
hilarious,
like Ned.
they have this hilarious
in the movies
conversation.
Right now, the current iteration of Spider-Man and Tom.
Yeah, Ned
Ned would be the.
kind of a loyal sidekick.
So they have this hilarious conversation where he says, "I'm Web Boy."
Oh,
He says, "You are nothing, man.
Yeah.
Stop this."
So what the sidekick does for the protagonist is that they are a support, whether it's emotional support, they offer comedic relief, or they have skills that the hero does not have. So for example, jumping back to the topic of Spider-Man with the MCU movies, Ned is definitely Spidey's go-to guy. He's a loyal sidekick. He offers emotional support because he's the first person to find out that Peter is Spider-Man outside of the Avengers. He's he's funny. He offers some comedic beats, but at the same time, he's got technical skills that Peter doesn't have. Like he's a good hacker, and Peter hasn't figured that out. So there are some skills there that are shared. Then we've got the ancient evil. That's another long-standing trope. This is a long dormant, malevolent force that reawakens. It's threatening destruction upon the world. In some cases, this could be this is usually used in more epic fantasy. A great example of this would be Thor Ragnarok, where Thor keeps getting visions of Surtur coming to Asgard and plunging his fiery sword into the heart of Asgard and destroying it. And
Would Sauron also count?
Sauron would also count as an ancient evil, but even beyond Sauron, if you're looking at Tolkien lore, Morgoth, who is the entity that turned Sauron into Sauron
Oh, okay.
and corrupted him in the first place.
I didn't even come across it.
Oh, if you read the Silmarillion gives this, it's this huge history of all of Middle Earth from like the second to.
No, I believe I don't know.
It is epic, but like if you think Sauron is bad, Morgoth was worse. Because Sauron actually started off as one of the Valar, basically an angel, and Morgoth shows up and says, "Hey, join me. I'll give you power," and he does.
And it's all about power.
Usually.
In the Tolkien stuff, it's all about power.
Well, it's about control. It's about power. It's about and because you have to look at where Tolkien was coming from. He was coming from his Christian roots, and he was highlighting the fact that that if you look at biblical scripture, every time something happens within humanity where humanity has become corrupted or they are doing things outside of whatever it is that God is wanting them to do, it comes down to the fact that they are putting themselves on the throne of creation, or trying to usurp God and the Creator, and basically giving God the finger. So
And things go bad.
and things go very bad. The next trope is the hidden world. This is Camp Half-Blood. This is the wizarding world. This could be Narnia, because Narnia is technically a hidden world inside of a wardrobe. Anytime you have this trope in play, what you're dealing with is a secret magical realm existing alongside the ordinary world. If you've ever watched a show called Grimm, or if you ever pick up a copy of one of the Bartimaeus books, in the Bartimaeus trilogy, for example, you're dealing with modern day London. You have all the current political hierarchy as far as like the prime minister and all the other minor offices underneath him. You still have a royal family, but the royal family are just figureheads. The prime minister runs everything, kind of like modern day. But the prime minister and all of his underlings are all magicians capable of summoning jinn and ifrits and all sorts of other entities to do their service and to do their labor. So like when you see like little pieces of paper fluttering through the air, magically flying from one office to the next, it's not just because they cast a spell and magic is moving it. It's not an ex machina. What they have done is they've summoned their imp, or they've summoned a jinn, or they've summoned some other kind of entity and said, go do this, but be invisible. And so that's how that world interacts. And so you have cases where the magical world infringes on the ordinary world, and it causes havoc, like in Grimm.
That would be when the invest and do naughty things.
I gotta ask this question. One of my favorite authors is Ursula K. Le Guin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she has this amazing ability to summon up a world, creates a world, and everything within her story about that world is pretty much normal. It's pretty much but one thing, like the dispossessed.
Right.
And you change that one thing, and a million other things come from that.
So another author that does this really, really, really well is Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman writes a ton of really awesome books.
Stardust.
Stardust.
On the rare times the movie is actually better than the book.
It's kind of right there. But she's right. Stardust is a really great one. Stardust is about this little town called Wall in the middle of England. It sits in the Highlands, or the flatlands of England, and quite literally, the only thing dividing the city or the town of Wall from this other world, this magical world, is a literal stone wall that only sits about 3.5 feet tall. And
it's either called
Stormhold, thank you.
Or Land of Fairy in the book, but I like the name of the one.
So if you cross that wall, you're in Stormhold. You're in a completely different realm that has its own laws, its own rules, its own form of government. You're no longer in England. But
the protagonist is Tristan, and he
yes. And so having that secret world, that hidden world, can be really helpful for delineating between what is real and what is fantasy.
That's pretty much like reality.
And in fact, Neil Gaiman actually uses this trope of a hidden world, frequently in his books. He does it again in Neverwhere, where the character Andrew Mayhew literally, is it Andrew? No, it's Peter Mayhew. Peter Mayhew literally picks up this woman named Lady Door, and in doing so, he becomes invisible to the rest of the world. Like, he continues living in his apartment, and he's sitting there eating cereal in his birthday suit, watching TV on his couch, and all of a sudden, a realtor comes walking in with a couple who want to buy his condo. He's like, "Hey, I'm standing right here. This place is not for sale." And they don't see him. They can't interact with him. They pass right through him because he no longer exists in that world. But he also does it again in Coraline, and Coraline is incredibly creepy, but it's a really well done story, and all it is a literal door in the wall.
That become button eyes for me.
Yeah, the button eyes are creepy.
And there's a number of stories. Well, I forget its name. It's Night Circus was also written by the same person.
I'm not familiar with it.
And the circus is an actual circus.
Mm-hmm.
It only exists for one night in one location and then moves. And it is, when you walk into the Night Circus, it's just not quite normal anymore.
Yeah. So then I think that one was The Vampire's Apprentice series. Anyway, Another trope is forbidden love. This is a romantic relationship between characters that is considered taboo or impossible due to specific reasons.
Anakin Padme.
Anakin Padme is a good one. And it's how you can play it off as much as you want. I usually don't. I do have it briefly in my first book, and it ends terribly. But that also becomes the impetus for one of my main characters to move on to his part of the adventure. Then you've got the tragic backstory. This is a character's past that is marked by significant trauma, loss, or betrayal, which shapes their motivations and their actions. You see this heavily in superheroes. You look at every major superhero, they are orphaned. They've watched their parents die in front of them. They watch their planet explode as they're flying away as an infant. They have been blinded by chemical fallout. They have fallen out of an airplane, which triggered laser beams to come out of their eyes. Pretty much any superhero ever invented in the last 100 years has a tragic backstory.
They all have a backstory.
And Spider-Man's is probably by far the most tragic because not only did he lose his parents, he lost his uncle and feels responsible for it, and he's super broke all the time.
I love the meme study recently of this time. Oh no, it's not a meme. It's a cutting from one of the Avengers comics where he's talking to Tony Stark, and Tony's like, "We have the money." Oh, thank God.
Yeah, I was just going to reference that. Another one is a band of misfits. You see this with Lord of the Rings. You see this with The Hobbit, especially with the tribe of dwarves. This is a diverse group of characters who come together for a common cause. At first, they're at odds and have to learn teamwork. The Avengers fits perfectly into this if you've seen the original film. Yeah.
Odd couples.
Yeah, odd couples do play into this. So you could have characters who play against type. One character who really knows what they're doing, another character who has no idea.
The one I'm running right now, one is a perfectly normal detective, and the person who becomes his partner is not human and doesn't think anything like him, doesn't think like anything like any other human because they're not human, but together they make a really good detective.
Right. There's a movie that came out a few years ago on Netflix called Bright, with Will Smith and Joel Edgerton, and it takes place it's an urban fantasy setting. It takes place in a world where orcs and fairies and all sorts of other creatures exist. And Joel Edgerton plays an orc who is brought onto the police force for LA, and he is partnered with Will Smith, who is a divorced, going broke sergeant. Who is, he's a veteran cop, and they're forced to work with each other, and they don't get along because, as a human, Will Smith's character, has it out for orcs, and so they play off of that prejudice and that bigotry to some extent because most of the other orcs that you see in the film exist as gang members. They kind of have like a tracksuit mafia vibe going on. Which is it's kind of interesting, but yeah, that's another way to play off the trope. Mysterious stranger. This is a character who appears suddenly, often with unclear motives, hidden knowledge, or a secret past. The T in secret is hidden, so it's secret. I apologize about that typo. I was doing this at like 1 o'clock this morning. But yeah, the mysterious stranger is one of those characters that I would recommend that if you are going to be writing a character like this, use it sparingly, because then you can keep it the more mysterious you can keep it, the better it'll be, because the payoff will work for your audience, because then they're going to be drawn to any time that character is encountered in the story. Then you've got the forsaken hero. This is a once great hero who has fallen from grace, often due to betrayal, tragedy, or personal flaws. So this can be Old Man Logan from Marvel Comics. This could be the version of Wolverine that we get in Deadpool and Wolverine. This could be some kind of knight errant who has been in dereliction of duty and is looking for redemption in some way, shape, or form. Another great Forsaken hero trope that gets played out, especially in something more recent, is if you look at, for example, Boromir from Lord of the Rings. Boromir, he's part of the Fellowship, and he ends up having this fall from grace when he is tempted by the ring and tries to kill Frodo. But at that point, he feels his shame, and in doing that, he actually attempts to protect Frodo as they're running from the orcs after they get out of the mines of Moria. So he had his personal flaws, he had his moment of betrayal, but he dies trying to redeem himself, and he does.
You also have the Forsaken hero that just doesn't care.
What about the
he
hero?
doesn't
that
want to
wasn't
be there.
chosen one?
What?
Okay, so in the instance of Luke versus and Anakin, right? Anakin was the chosen one.
Yeah.
Would he then become the Forsaken hero by the time we get to Return of the Jedi?
Yes, Anakin has become the Forsaken hero because he betrayed the Jedi Order. He killed all of his fellow Jedi, or most of them. He turned them towards the dark side to be Inquisitors. He suffered the tragedy of killing his own wife by accident, or at least breaking her heart to the point where she died. And he had his personal flaws because of his arrogance and his anger and all the other stuff that he deals with. James.
Would Judas be Forsaken hero?
I would not consider him a Forsaken hero because he was not a protagonist in the Bible. He was marked specifically as a traitor. If anything, he would be a secret antagonist rather than like a secret heir or secret hero. But he is forsaken, that's for sure. Now, I did mention that there was going to be a secret subject matter, and that is dragons. You can't talk about fantasy without talking dragons. And so I've got a small list of 5 types of common dragons that you're going to encounter in fantasy. There are far more than this, but these are 5 that I thought were really fun. The first one is a basilisk. You see this in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. It is a serpent or dragon that causes death with its gaze. It is limbless, it is snake-like, and it's said that in order to hatch, you put a snake's egg under a toad. And when it hatches, you get a basilisk. And if you see it eye to eye, it will it won't petrify you, it will kill you. But if you see the reflection of its gaze, it petrifies you. At least in Harry Potter.
Be undone by running water, according to some myth.
Some myth. The next one is the wyvern, or wyvern, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It is a dragon-like creature. It has 4 limbs. The 2 front limbs are actually its wings, and hind limbs are regular legs. It breathes fire. It looks like a dragon. So if you've ever watched Game of Thrones, the way that those dragons are designed, those are wyverns.
And it irritates me every time they say dragon.
It's still technically a dragon. It's just a subspecies of dragon. Dragon is consider dragon like a generic term for these creatures. Kind of like the way we say cat or dog. Just because it's a pug doesn't mean it's any less of a dog.
Ugly, but it's a dog.
Exactly.
I don't like the practice of
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, we had pug discourse to discuss.
The next one is a hydra. This is a mythical creature. We see this in Greek mythology. We see it being used as an opponent in one of the 12 trials of Hercules. It has multiple heads with the ability to regenerate those heads when they are wounded. The way that this labor of Hercules was completed was that in order to kill it, he had to cauterize every stump that he cut. So anytime he cut off a head to prevent 2 more from growing back in its place, he cauterized that wound with a torch. In the Disney version, he crushes it with a rock slide. The next one we get is a drake. Now, there's some kind of back and forth on this. About 20, 30 years ago, the term drake simply meant a male dragon. I'll come to your question in just a moment, James. But in this case, a drake is a wingless quadrupedal dragon. They're the smallest form of dragon that you'll typically see. but they're incredibly extra strong. Their claws are incredibly sharp. They're known for living in caves and rock formations. They're usually really good at digging. In fact, in my second book, The Destiny of Dragons, the different elder dragons that my hero Gavin meets falls into these types of different subtypes of dragons. James, what was your question?
Doesn't a Hydra that breathe fire from that?
It can, not typically. They may also summon storms. I mean, if you look at the mythology behind the character of King Ghidorah from the Japanese Toei and Heisei Godzilla eras, he summons storms and shoots lightning from his mouth.
That's
So,
exciting.
so it just depends on how you want to play with it. And sometimes, a lot of the times, dragons are usually associated with some kind of elemental magic, and so you can play around with that if you want. The next one, yes.
Actually, unfortunately, I wish I could stay on.
No, you can't leave.
Okay. I can't leave?
No. The next one is the Western dragon. This is the most common type of dragon that usually is thought of when you talk, when we're talking fantasy. It's known for their immense size, their powerful wings. They have 4 actual legs, plus the wings, and so technically they have 6 limbs, and they have a fiery breath. This is typically what most people think of when they think of dragons. But you can also look at, for example, Asian dragons. You look at Southeast Asia, and dragons are associated with water. You look at China and Japan, those dragons are associated with fire and sky. So just depending on what culture you want to pull from. There are also, if you look at ancient Near East cultures, the Leviathan is technically a sea serpent akin to, say, a basilisk, and it is representative of the tumult of the sea and the chaos and the disorganization of the deep water and the grave.
I have one comment about dragons and writing.
Yeah.
Dragons are really super powerful.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, when you introduce a dragon, you've introduced a very powerful element that then has the tendency to be the element. And if you don't have a way of dealing with that, don't introduce a dragon.
Right.
Sorry, I was laughing because I heard my kid. Where's mommy? That's why I was laughing.
One,
I was trying to laugh.
one of the things that I do with my series is that I kind of introduce early on that dragons are an endangered species. They're not savage. They're not feral animals. They are sentient beings in my series. And
Common mythology of dragons, especially like Eastern dragons, were what wizened beings akin to God and deity, and especially like for Shinto in Japan, I think they have a similar word.
yeah, and so depending on which culture you're drawing from, the further west you go, the more dragons are considered feral monsters, whereas the further east you go, they're deified.
I find that very interesting if you think about it. The East versus West discourse of how a dragon is considered noble, intelligent versus feral, bestial, and kind of like not just the religious, components that might change.
You have to look at how cultures change and evolve over time, and how they get assimilated by other cultures. Like the Greek culture got heavily assimilated by the Romans, which eventually got heavily assimilated by Western European ideals, and got influenced by Norse mythology and Germanic mythology. So we're talking writing tips, and then we'll wrap up here in just a few minutes, and then we'll do the writing prompt. So I've got 10 tips for you. The first one is fantasy is not a one-size-fits-all. Okay? What you do to write your fantasy story, that's on you. You do not have to emulate Brandon Sanderson. You do not have to emulate J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or any other major fantasy writer. Do what you want to do. Have fun with it. Okay? One of the things I do is I start looking at elements from science fiction, and I ask myself, how can I incorporate that into a fantasy world. So, for example, one of the elder dragons in my series, his name is Balerion. He's this elder dragon. He's a little kooky. He's a little crazy. Might have split personality disorder. And he is, for centuries, has been locked away in this citadel, this tower, in the middle of one of the kingdoms in my series. And in order to reach where he is in the top of the tower, you have to walk into the front of the tower, which the door faces south. You walk in, and you immediately stand on a dais that's probably about the size of this room, circular dais, or no, it's an octagonal dais, and it immediately starts rising like an elevator. And it does this not because of any mechanism, but because magic is the ex machina. All right. So and the way I based that is I was playing Halo one day, and I was at the original game, and I was playing through one of the underground levels, and I'm like, dude, these really large elevators are really cool. How can I incorporate that into my story? Instead of a control panel, magic runes, boom, done. Okay, have fun with it, play around with the tropes, make it your own. Second tip, you need to understand the genre. If you are not familiar with fantasy, if you're not familiar with the tropes, if you're not familiar with this, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tap onto tip 3 as well, as far as understanding the subgenres. If you don't understand what it is that you want to write, don't touch it. There are a lot of people who try to jump into fantasy. They try to write something, and it does not work. It falls flat because they don't understand the world building. They don't understand what they're trying to accomplish. Okay? Like for me, I don't understand writing romance or how to make it appeal to readers, so I'm not even going to try. That's not my thing. Okay? I get uncomfortable writing about two characters kissing, let alone anything more steamy than that. Okay? I don't want to write that kind of stuff because personally, I don't want to read it. All right, the next one is magic systems come in all flavors. We will talk about magic systems right before we do the writing prompt, but magic systems come in all flavors. Okay? You can have a hard magic system where you have all these rules delineated and detailed, and you have like how it's supposed to work, all the mechanics of the magic, or you can have a soft magic system. Okay? Harry Potter is a hard magic system. Everything in Harry Potter has a rule. In order to conjure magic, you have to be using a wand most of the time. In Harry Potter, you have to use a spell. Now the spell can be an unspoken spell where you're thinking it and concentrating on it in your mind, but you have to know the spell before you can perform it. Okay, and each one of those spells has a meaning behind the word that's used. Expelliarmus literally means empty the arm or remove the weapon. Okay, it's a play on some Latin words. Reducto means to reduce. If you have, oculus reparo, fix eye. It fixes glasses, okay? Potions have limitations. They have time limits, or they have to require specific ingredients. They have to have specific time to brew and stuff like that. What you don't see in Harry Potter Chamber of Secrets film is that it takes over a month to brew the polyjuice potion that allows characters to look like other characters. There are set rules. But then you look at, say, The Lord of the Rings. And anytime Gandalf uses his magic to do anything, you don't see him really recite any spells. You don't see him focus on anything. You just see him just stamp his staff and something happens. Or he'll say, "You shall not pass!" And a Balrog falls through a bridge of Khazad Dûm. Okay? Play around with it, but be consistent. The next one is build the world as you go. Okay, I'm going to put a caveat on this. You do need to have some world building before you jump into the writing process, but once you have kind of a basis for how the world is supposed to be structured, begin writing, begin incorporating your characters, and build the world as you go. You don't need huge info dumps about what your world is like right up front. That is going to bore the snot out of your readers.
Jack London.
Okay?
5 pages to describe, if I remember correctly, a setting room and...
Yeah, but Tolkien spent the first chapter of Fellowship of the Ring writing about a stupid blade of grass. So, and he's still considered the master.
Yeah, but Jack London is more boring, so that's why
Yeah, you're not wrong. Okay, tip number 6. Your world and your plot go hand in hand. Okay? What happens in your plot should affect your world. The way your world operates should affect your plot. They are two sides of the same coin. Tip number 7. Fantasy can be character-driven, plot-driven, or both. Okay? Now, if you're using the hero's journey as your structure, your narrative structure, if you're using some kind of prophecy to direct what is happening for your main character, that's great. That's plot-driven. But the character should also be capable of making their own choices. They should have agency in the process of what happens. I was talking with a friend of mine. He just had a new book come out a couple months ago, and he was talking about how he's trying to decide how many books he wants to go for a series. It's this horror thriller mystery series that he's doing called based on a character called Paisley Mott. And so Calvin, if you're watching this, I'm giving you a name drop here. He was telling me about how he's getting the bare bones of book 3 set in place, and he's not sure if he's going to go for 5 books or if he's going to go for 7 books. It all depends on a choice that Paisley has to make in book 3. And he's like, Paisley will surprise you. She's the kind of character that just when I think I know what she's going to do next, she surprises me. And he's treating this character as if she is a living, breathing person, because in his head she is.
So that's not crazy.
It's not crazy, no. It's allowing for the characters to evolve through the plot.
Because I've got 2 stories, which I wrote at 2 different times, which were not supposed to be the least bit connected. And then I look up and I say, oh shit, the protagonist in story A and the protagonist in story B are the same character.
I like to call that the plot bunny hopping away.
15 years apart, and one guy is a high-tech, high security guy, and the other guy is like a hermit.
Yeah.
And it's like, I was in tears. Like,
Yeah.
what happened to this guy in those intervening 15 years? And I have not even approached. I'm not writing that right now.
Yeah.
But they're the same guy.
Yeah. So, tip 8. You want to develop your characters. You want to make sure that your characters aren't some cookie cutter version of something that we've seen before.
Divergent.
You want to make sure that your characters, each one has their own voice, that they have their own development, that they have their own personality. I mean, because
They were good in the early 2000s. Treasure Planet was probably one of the really good ones where they took an old story and revamped it without killing it.
right. But what I'm getting at here is what I'm getting here is you don't want your characters. You don't want to have 2 characters in the same scene who are exactly the same thing. Like, for example, if I was to describe Edward and Jacob from the Twilight series, they're essentially the same character. The only difference is one is a vampire, one is a werewolf. One is incredibly pale, the other one is a little bit more tan.
Oh.
Okay, that's really all it is, and all they are is a stand-in for the wish fulfillment that the author would like her stand-in self-inserting character to fall in love with. That's it. That's the only purpose they serve. Other than that, they are the same character. They both obsess over Bella. They both work tooth and nail, almost literally, to take control of her life when she doesn't want to have to do anything to do with either of them half the time. So develop your characters. Make sure that they are unique to your story. Number 9, keep it fresh. Look for new ways to take those tropes that we talked about earlier and turn them on their heads and do something different with them. All right. And then number 10, you want to outline. Before you ever sit down to write a single word, you need to lay out exactly what's going to happen in your plot. You don't have to be super detailed, but you do need to make sure that your outline is ready to go before you write a word, because otherwise what's going to happen is if you don't have a roadmap for how your story is going to flow, you are going to miss the plot. You're going to have characters hanging out in one area when they should be over here. You should be you will lose track of where your characters are at any given time. You'll lose track of what they're talking about. You need to know. All right. With that said, we are going to briefly touch on a few things regarding magic systems, and then I'll provide you with your writing prompt. So magic systems. All right. We talked about hard systems. We talked about soft systems briefly. You want to define the magic source. So for this, I'm going to be referencing the Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra series very extensively, because the world building on their magic system is phenomenal. Okay? You need to define the magic source. Where does magic come from? Where does that energy come from? In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the ability to bend the elements comes from the lion turtles. It is passed on to them. And as we look at in season 2 of Legend of Korra, the first Avatar was a guy named Wan, who wanted to restore balance between the human world and the spirit world. He bonds with the spirit Rava to keep her from being destroyed. And through her, he begins learning all 4 elements, and he starts with fire, because that was his native element. And he goes and collects the other 4 in a cycle, which creates the Avatar cycle. Okay? Set clear rules and limits. That's the next thing. You want to make sure that when you're writing a magic system, that there are rules that your characters have to follow. Do they have to conjure a spell? Do they have to use their hand? Do they have to use a wand? In Harry Potter, they have to use a wand. But if you pay attention to the film version of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, as they're walking through the 3 broomsticks, there is a scene, maybe it's the Leaky Cauldron, I can't remember which one.
Leaky Cauldron.
Yeah, there's a scene where there is a wizard reading Stephen Hawking and doing wandless magic, stirring the spoon in his coffee. That is the wizard that I'm terrified of, because that guy understands quantum physics.
Maybe it's not, I don't know if they have to use the wand, or so much as the wand is a focusing agent.
And more than likely that's the case, because there's a lot of magic in Harry Potter
Because
that...
there's spoken and unspoken spells as
Right.
well. Like
And that's why
American
the
wizards.
ones that don't need a wand are very...
They're the scariest.
They are the
Because
very
like
old
if you don't
wizards.
need to be focused, and
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about quantum physics and magic, science
Let-
and magic.
That's a topic for another time, though.
Sorry.
I want to get back on this because we're running out of time. But Avatar sets clear rules and limits. Not everybody is a bender. You have a lot more people who are benders, or a lot who are not benders than you do who are benders. But as those benders start having kids of their own, that dynamic shifts. You start having more and more people who are benders, but they're limited to what they can do with their native element. You have firebenders. Firebenders can't do earthbending. However, when you get to Legend of Korra, you have 2 brothers, Mako and Bolin. Mako is a firebender, Bolin is an earthbender.
And he can lava bend, which
And
was
he eventually learns how to lava bend. He tries metal bending, it fails for him because he's not a metal bender, he's a lava bender. So those 2 cultural heritages and the limitations and rules of their bending styles work in tandem for him. Whereas Mako, as a firebender, learns how to lightning bend, and lightning bending was only something that was done during the days of Avatar Aang by the Fire Nation royal family. It was only a royal power.
Mhm. Which made Zuko's ability
To redirect lightning.
and choice not to learn lightning so, perfect for his character.
Yeah.
Because he was absolutely the rebellious son.
Okay, so you want to develop types and strains of magic. So Avatar does this very well with the different 4 elements. You've got your standard 4. You've got air, earth, water, and fire. But in each of those, there are different strains. So for example, for earth bending, you get metal bending. You get lava bending. You get sand bending. You get glass bending.
That
Okay.
just sounds terrifying. I bet glass and sand are almost identical.
Right, but then with waterbenders can manipulate the moisture in the air for fog. They can manipulate it into ice, especially if they're in more cold temperatures. They can freeze rain and turn it into little needles.
Bloodbending would be the special.
Bloodbending is the darkest one. And that actually gets taken to another level with a character with a character that's introduced in Legend of Korra, who does psychic bloodbending, where he can do it from a distance, and he can actually use it to take bending away from other people. And what he's doing is he's redirecting those chi pathways. Okay? Don't make it too easy to learn. Magic should have limitations. It's like learning any skill or whether it's a physical skill or a technical skill, you need to develop it over time. Like when I started learning how to play guitar, I had no idea what I was doing. I had to figure that out, and I've been playing for over 20 years. And I'm still learning stuff. I am not a master. Okay? Do not make it easy to learn. Connect it to your characters. All the characters' personalities in Avatar: The Last Airbender are a reflection of their bending styles. Aang is an avatar. Aang as an airbender, he is flighty. He has a goofy sense of humor, which is something that's notable about airbenders to begin with. But not only that, the way he moves, the way he fights, it's all these circular movements meant to dodge and deflect and redirect attacks. Waterbending is about the push and pull of water, being able to accept the attack and redirect it back as a counterattack. Firebending is always about forward momentum, forward force, strength, energy. Earthbending, when you look at a character like Toph, she uses the ground, she's blind, so she uses the ground and the seismic waves that she's able to generate to be able to see where other people are, to see what they're doing, how they're moving, and she can counteract on that because she's paying attention to that. But she also develops the metal bending because she's strong, she is tough, and you see that reflected in her personality. She starts off when she's first introduced, she's this demure, sweet, blind little girl. Then she gets out in the open, she gets out in the countryside, and she is gruff, she is dirty, she is mean.
Did she call the dirt a protective layer?
Yep. She likes a nice, healthy layer of dirt. All right. Then you want to introduce consequences. What happens when those powers go awry, like bloodbending? Once someone bloodbends for the first time, it completely changes how they operate. Because then they realize that they have the ability to control and puppet other people.
Tara was horrified and she never wanted to do it again, but when push came to shove, you could see she became a bit of a darker character after.
Oh yeah,
point.
Exactly. But then you look at lightning bending. If you are redirecting lightning and you do it wrong, or you absorb the lightning bolt wrong, you can kill yourself. Firebending is one of those things where if you lose control of the flame, it will destroy other things. It is harder to control than all the other elements. You also need to allow it to evolve. Allow that magic to change. You see this happening again in Avatar: The Last Airbender, where characters develop new skills. Metal bending was thought to be impossible. So
Toph happened.
And then exactly. And then Toph happened. And then you need to balance those magic skills. Certain elements they balance each other out. So for like Aang, because of his personality, he's an airbender. While he was able to easily pick up waterbending, earthbending is harder for him because it's the natural opposite to air. It requires him to be stable, to stay in position instead of jumping around and moving out of the way like he is prone to doing. And then you want to create a culture around that magic. And as I've already talked about, the four nations already, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, already do that. So, we've got 16 minutes left. I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes to work on the prompt. Here we go. I love these effects. They're fun. Here is your writing prompt. A character is hiking in the wilderness and encounters a magical creature. This could be a dragon, a mermaid, a djinn, whatever you want it to be. The creature hates humans and wants to eat or destroy the character, and the character must convince it to let him or her pass. You have 10 minutes Go. You've got a phone. Use your notepad.
I just got this phone. I don't know how to cut those. 'Cause
I can give you paper.
And I was about to ask, because this paper is not good for writing, because it's the green paper. Can I have one piece, please? Because that's not anything.
All right, logging off, guys. Thank you for joining.